Now, yesterday, I suggested that from my thinking and reading and dialogue with others, I have distilled a list of about 10 criteria, and we dealt with two of them yesterday. That a healthy church needs to be truth-based, and we went into what that might mean, that is not just doctrinally based, although doctrines are important, but that is based on a relationship with Him who is the truth. Truth-based, and our faith in a healthy church should not be toxic. And we discussed a few elements that I would consider to be toxic, and there are probably other elements that could be mentioned. Now, today we're going to discuss three more of those criteria, and we start with number 3, and that is that we should be clear about our identity. As Seventh-day Adventist Christian believers, we must know that we exist for a reason, and that there is in the message that we carry to the world a special emphasis that the world, including other Christians, need. At the same time, when we are clear about our identity as to who we are, we must also be willing to adapt and to change as change may be needed because of the change of the world around us. Not a change in our principles, but a change in the way we talk about them and the way we illustrate them and the way we apply them. We must be sure who we are. To be a healthy church, we must be sure who we are. And I would suggest to you that we are part of God's church, but as we said earlier in the week, our church is not the church of God. God has many children who are not yet part of our movement. We have brothers and sisters also in other communities. And I think it's time that we left behind ourselves the kind of enemy thinking that we have had in the past. When a century ago, or more than a century ago, Adventism began and was developing, it was in the context of a world that was largely Christian. Other denominations, Catholics, Protestants, etc. And of course, they were not very kind to us in many cases, and we were not very kind to them in many cases. We live now in a different world. Most of the world around us is no longer Christian. And let's be happy that we are not the only Christians, that there are other Christians besides us. At the same time, we must be sure that we know where we differ and what contribution we can make and what emphases we have, what special messages we have that can help others to grow in their Christian experience. So what is identity? When we say we must be clear about our Christian identity, if we want to be a healthy church, what is it? And if we say we must be clear about our Adventist identity, what is that? And sometimes we talk about American Adventism or European Adventism or South American Adventism. Now, what is, or is there such a thing as an Australian Adventist identity? Or a Dutch Adventist identity? Another question is that identity that we have static, unchanging, or does it change and develop? The next question would be, do we actually have an identity crisis? Now, in some countries, people say we no longer know who we are. You know, there is an influx of so many people coming from different regions of the world. What is our identity? What is my Dutch identity? Is it not being watered down by all these people who have come from elsewhere? Is there an identity crisis in our society? Some people feel there is an identity crisis in our church. And they wonder, now, what is a true Seventh-day Adventist? Who is a genuine Seventh-day Adventist? And that question is asked and answered differently in many parts of the world. Well, to start with, identity, and that is also true for Seventh-day Adventist identity, because as far as I know, we're also human beings. There are different aspects in what is identity. What makes me who I am? Ethnicity, nationality, my profession. When I say I am, I can fill in on the dots several words. As far as ethnicity is concerned, I am Caucasian. I'm a white person. Well, maybe a little pink, but nationality, well, I'm from the Netherlands. Profession, education, well, I can fill that in. I am a pastor, and I'm retired, been a church administrator, I've been different things in the church. I am, all these things are part of my identity. Education, I have an academic background. Gender, male. Sexual orientation, well, I can tell you I am happily married, so that should say something about my sexual orientation. My hobbies define me. Well, I can't say that any sport defines me, because I'm not that great in different sports. But my political and social convictions define me, and of course my religion and my religious affiliation. All these things define who I am. And that is true for all of us. There are many different aspects that go into our identity. And when it comes to this last factor, our religious identity, then, you know, this differs from person to person. Are people really religious, or are they in fact non-religious? Fakely religious? Or people who say, well, I believe in something and I'm really a spiritual person. Are people Christian, Muslim? Or are they maybe agnostic? You know, agnostics are people who say we simply don't know. We are not prepared to say there is a God, and we are not prepared to say there is no God. We simply don't know. And then there are the atheists who say, well, there is no God, period. If we are religious, are we active members in our church? Or is our identity, our religious identity, more or less defined by the conflict that we have with the church? Have you noticed that when people have an issue with the church, that can become a very important factor in who they are and how they conduct themselves? It comes up all the time. It almost defines now, at least in part, who they are. Is religion a dominant aspect of my life? So, religion is an aspect of our identity, but that we can ask many questions with regard to how that religious aspect of our identity functions. Becomes more complicated, and that many people who've come from elsewhere, now that is true for Australia, of course, you have many people who've come from elsewhere. Now, many of them now have a plural identity because they are now Australians, but they're also still Samoans or have come from the other islands. Or many people this week have told me, well, you know, my parents came from Germany, or they themselves came from Germany, or from the former Yugoslavia, or whatever. Many of those people have a dual identity. They are rooted in their past, where they came from, and at the same time, they are now part of the society where they have come to live. And then there is something, and that is slightly more complicated, which I would call the postmodern development. The fragmentation that, you know, sometimes we seem to be different people depending on the role we play at a certain moment. And people can be quite different when they are in church from when they are in their sports club or at work. Jacques Derrida, the name is there, Jacques Derrida is one of the key philosophers behind the postmodern philosophy. He's a Frenchman. I would suggest that you don't try to read his books because they're so convoluted that, you know, people who say, I distrust people who say that they understand what he has written. But anyway, this Mr. Jacques Derrida, if you would ask him, how are you? He would say, in what room? Because he compared his life to a house. And he would be sometimes in the kitchen of his house, or he would be in the bedroom of his house, he would be in this particular room, that particular room. And how he felt, how he acted, even sometimes how he spoke, depended on the room of the house in which he was at that particular moment. Our fragmented identity. You know, we are one of these countries who still have a royal family. Well, of course, you do in a way, don't you? But we have King Alexander, Willem-Alexander, and he is married with Maxima. And Maxima has come from Argentina. And she has actually learned the Dutch language, speak the Dutch language quite fluently in a very short time. Very popular she is. But she once said something that, you know, do you feel, when asked, are you now a real Dutch person? And she said, well, you know, there is no real Dutch person. Now, maybe that was not that tactful an answer to give. But it's true, you know, who is the real Dutch person? Who is the real Australian? So, because we are often fragmented in who we are, in our identity. So that when I say we must be a healthy church, we must be clear about our identity, then I mean to say that we must be clear about our Adventist identity. Who are we as Seventh-day Adventists? Now, traditionally, you would say, well, what characterizes Seventh-day Adventist? Well, first of all, of course, we have the truth. And then, yes, who are we? We belong to God's last church on earth. We are the remnant. And we are characterized by some key doctrines. We believe in the Sabbath. We keep Sunday on Saturday. We believe in the second coming, the soon second coming of Christ. And we have this quite complicated sanctuary doctrine. Those are things that set us apart, that are part of our religious identity. And then, of course, our lifestyle. And unfortunately, we are sometimes better known for the things that we don't do than for the things that we do. Because Adventists don't eat pork, they don't smoke, they don't drink, etc. And then, traditionally, we have said, well, okay, we are here, we are the remnant, we're God's people, and all these others, they are the enemy, they are Babylon. That has been the way Adventists thought about themselves. And some people still do. But Adventism has developed over time. Our Adventist theology has developed. Now, if you're in doubt about that, find that little book written by George Knight about the history of our theology, of our teachings. We have developed. He says if James White were alive today, he might not want to become a Seventh-day Adventist when he reads our fundamental beliefs. Because there are many things in there that he did not believe. We have developed over time, and we continue to develop. And those of us who have had the privilege of traveling the world, we will find that some things in Adventism are highlighted more in one particular region of the world than in another region of the world. There are some regional differences. And developments, well, by the way, you also see that in local churches. Some churches have developed in a slightly different way from other local churches. But these developments also take place in different ways and at different speeds. So that brings a number of challenging aspects with regard to our Adventist identity. We are changing, yes, and the world around us is changing. And I've said it a number of times that we are now living in a world where Christians are mostly a minority, and the non-Christians are the greatest majority. We live in a time of secularism, and that is probably the greatest enemy of religious, of Christian thinking. And we find that most Adventists have changed as to the belief who is going to be saved. Now, even when I was growing up as a child, there were many people around me who believed that if you did not accept all the aspects of the Seventh-day Adventist message, you would be lost. And if you did not take the chance of becoming acquainted with the Seventh-day Adventist message, that would be very dangerous. If you had had a pamphlet in your letterbox inviting you to take a correspondence course of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and you had thrown that in the wastepaper basket, well, then you really had rejected the chance to know the truth. And so it was very clear who was going to be saved. We were talking about 144,000. And there was quite a discussion as to whether that was a literal number or whether maybe that was a spiritual number. But anyway. Now, most Seventh-day Adventists would not say today, look, we are the only ones to be saved. We believe it's important to be Seventh-day Adventist, but most of us, fortunately, would say it's up to God to determine who is going to be saved. And, as Christ said, he has many sheep that are not yet part of this flock. So there has been a change in thinking as to who we are. And I think that's healthy. There has also sometimes been a change in the way we think about our lifestyle principles. Now, that change has not always been so healthy, because we still believe in our lifestyle principles, but in some cases, we are much easier about some of these things. Now, we could talk about this for some time, because I would say that it's time that we look at some of the principles and that we see, are we really applying them in the right direction, in a direction that fits with the 21st century? Or should we take the principles and look again at the way we apply them? But enough. There are changes taking place in the way we see ourselves. But that change does not take place everywhere at the same speed and in the same way, and that creates tensions among us. Now, it's not only important to know how we see ourselves, but how do others see us? How are we seen, for instance, by other Christians? And unfortunately, certainly in the past, and certainly where I come from, we have often been seen as being quite legalistic. Because, Seventh-day Adventists are people who really still look at these Old Testament laws and about what they eat and what they drink. And Adventists, really, they are not fun to be with. Now, smoking is not so much of a problem these days, but 50 years ago, if you didn't smoke, you were more or less an outcast, because a normal person, at least a normal man, would smoke. That, fortunately, we have left behind. But, okay, when you refuse to take a glass of wine at the reception, Seventh-day Adventists are people who are very rigid. They say no. So, and what's wrong with taking a glass of wine? And then, Seventh-day Adventist people have this stupid habit. They must give 10% of their income to the church. Now, that's not a very attractive proposition, is it? And then people say, well, okay, you're Sabbath keepers. But that's funny, really. And why do you do that? As long as you keep one day holy, why does it need to be the Saturday and go against the tide? And so, that is the way other people look at us in many ways. And then there is that question that keeps being asked all the time. Do Seventh-day Adventists actually believe in grace? Or are they people of the law, or do they believe in grace? There is this very interesting book, What's So Amazing About Grace? And I'm trying to think of the name of the author. Yancey. Very, very interesting author. And I saw there are some books by Yancey in the bookstore here. What is so amazing about grace? And he actually refers to some examples of Seventh-day Adventists in that book that he found have a very limited understanding of grace. Now, when we are accused of being people, of legalistic people, of being people who are more interested in the law than in anything else, is that accusation valid? Well, to a certain extent, it is and has been. But, in early Adventism, for instance, there was so much antagonism against us from the world around us. And they were not attacking us on the fact that we believed in atonement through Jesus Christ, but they were attacking us on points of, like we just mentioned, the Sabbath, our lifestyle issues, etc. And we had constantly to defend ourselves. So we came across as people who were more interested in that type of thing than in anything else. And we know there was a watershed. It's interesting to read the history, the background of the General Conference that was held in 1888 in Minneapolis, where it came to really a confrontation between law and grace. Weckerer and Jones, who proposed that our emphasis should change, they were supported by Ellen White. Others who felt that that would be a betrayal towards traditional Seventh-day Adventists. So it was a watershed. And from then onwards, there was more emphasis on righteousness, not by the law, but by faith through Jesus Christ. But legalism has been a persisting problem in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the perception of many people around us is still that Seventh-day Adventism is a religion of rules. That is, in the eyes of many, what is our identity? And I would suggest that to be a healthy church, the identity must, first of all, be characterized by grace. That must be the foundation of who and what we are. We are children of God. We have our own diverse ethnic and national and cultural identity, yes. But we are children of God. That must be the overarching element of our identity. God so loved us before we even loved him. Our religion, yes, must be characterized by obedience and commitment, but that is because there is grace and we are children of God. So I would hope that one of the criteria of being a healthy church is that we have a gracious identity. And that identity must be a dominant part of who we are individually and corporately. Above anything else, above all the other things that we are, our identity must be being in Christ. That's an important aspect of a healthy church. A healthy church consists of people who see their identity, first of all, as being children of God through his grace. Okay then, the next criteria for a healthy church is that we must not only have a clear view of who we are, but also of what we must do. True mission implies, I believe, witness first, or rather than organization building. We are not just in the business of recruitment, of signing up people, but we are in the business of witnessing. And then we hope and pray that people will do something with the witness, but we are not going to push them. We want Christ, through his Spirit, to convince them. A healthy church has no obsession with numbers. I alluded to that yesterday. Of course, we remain interested in numbers. Even in the book of Acts, it says that the Lord increased daily to their number. And it tells us this day so and so many were added to the church. There's still the interest in numbers, of course, and you need statistics for organizational purposes. But sometimes we can be so obsessed that that kind of screws the way we do our witness. In our witness, we must be preaching Christ rather than promoting a doctrinal system. Now, I'm not saying that we should not talk about doctrines. But when doctrines become a system, and we almost worship the doctrinal system rather than the person about whom the doctrinal system is all about, then there's something wrong. Our witness must consist of teaching and disciple making. Our witness in the 21st century requires communicational skills. We must have a message that is relevant, and that's a big challenge to explain to people, to our own people, especially to our younger generation, how our message is relevant, how it impacts on their everyday life. It's quite a few years ago now that I was confronted with a man who was about to die. It was terminal. And he asked me to come and visit him. And I wondered why he asked for me, because I was not his local pastor. But then, when I got into his bedroom, he said to me, "Look under the bed." And under the bed was a tin box, and he said, "Take it. Look inside." It was filled with cash. tens of thousands of euros. Well, guilders at that time. And he said, that's for you and for your work. I felt very uneasy because I knew there was something fishy. Well, it appeared, even before he died, that really this was money that his sister had left behind when she died a couple of months earlier. And she had told him to take that money to her church, the Catholic Church. But he felt that was a waste of money. So he was going to give it to me. Now here was a man who always knew all the answers in any Sabbath school class that he attended. He was not a very pleasant Christian, I can tell you. He was a fanatic in many ways. But even in his final moments, he managed not to be honest. So I ask myself the question now, who did he worship? A system? Or did he worship the one whom the system relates to? And that brought me to writing a little book. It is time. And the issue is really, it's time to start not only to repeat what we believe, but to start thinking about what it really implies. And so I asked myself, this is a good exercise for me. If I believe this, okay, how does that impact on my Christian life? If I believe that God is the Father, now I'm a father, how does his fatherhood imply on the way I am a father? And I took every one of the then 27 fundamental beliefs and asked myself that question. And I challenge you to do the same, because that's what it's all about. That people not only learn theoretically about the doctrines, but they can only be a healthy Christian if they see the connection between each of these fundamental beliefs with their daily life. Today, we are in a postmodern mission field. Our preaching and our witnessing no longer takes place in a Christian context. People sometimes know very little about Christianity. You know, my wife and I, we sometimes looked at a program on British television, University Challenge. Very interesting program, teams from different universities competing with one another. And of course they take the brightest students. But these questions are so difficult. Now, we consider ourselves as to be reasonably educated, but 9 out of 10 questions we cannot answer. But then when there is a question about the Bible, who was the father of Jacob? Hardly anyone will ever know the answer, because they no longer know about Christianity. You know, when I was working for the Trans-European Division, we opened up the work in Albania after the period of communism there. And knowledge of the Bible was totally eradicated from that country. If you would ask them, who is Joseph? They would say, well, does he also live here in Tirana? No inkling. And that is much of the world in which we live today. No inkling of what it is. Chesterton, this important writer, he once said, when people cease to believe in the Christian God, it's not that they believe in nothing, but they believe in just about anything. That's our experience, isn't it? So these are the people that we have to witness to. People who are interested still in spirituality, many of them at least, but they mix all kinds of things from all kinds of traditions, and they ask themselves not what is true, but what feels good. What feels good must be good. People only have a very vague notion of what sin means, of what guilt means. They operate on a relational basis. That is what is important to them. They want to participate in things, but they're ignorant about Christian basics and the Bible. Now, the American theologian Niebuhr, he told us, or told the people around him in his books, that our witness must have substance. You know, that's one side that people know very little, but we must not water down our message so that the message says very little. But I agree fully with Niebuhr. He says, a God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministry of Christ without a cross. Think about that. So, in order to witness as a healthy community, there must first of all be the integrity and the authenticity of the messenger. And I find that very important. That is why I chose that as one of the topics for one of my sermons this week. We must be real. A healthy Christian is a real person. A healthy church is an authentic church. We must listen to the stories of the people, must be willing to be vulnerable and be honest about ourselves, about our own story. But we must realize that there is no standard unbeliever. They come in all different shapes and sizes. And there are both believers and unbelievers also in our own church. There are actually many people in our church who struggle with very basic questions. There are many younger and older people who say, well, is there really a God? You'd be surprised at the amount of correspondence I received when I dealt with these questions in a recent book. And people say, yeah, I have those doubts. And I've had these terrible things happening in my life. Is there a God? That's not a question just people outside of us ask. That's a question also that people in the church ask. There are believers, unbelievers, doubters around us in the church. We must be aware of that in our witness. Now, it'd be tempting to talk at length about some of these things, but I watched the clock. Our goal when we witness and when we deal with questions within our own community is that people will have an encounter with Christ. And we realize that people have a fear of being recruited, of being signed up. They're suspicious. We must also, in this postmodern world, be aware of the fact that coming to Christ it may happen overnight, but it may also, and more often, be a very long process. 50 years ago, it was very common, also in a Western setting, to have an evangelistic meeting and after 6 weeks have people prepared to be baptized. Nowadays, and you may disagree with me if you have proof, but nowadays in the Western world, it more often than not takes years from the moment a person first enters our church and the person enters the baptismal font. In fact, in many countries, the average time is now 7 to 8 years. It takes a very long time. And some people actually never take that final step. In fact, there was somebody here this week who told me, I've been coming to the Seventh-day Adventist Church now for 60 years, but I've never been baptized. John Pauline, a theologian now at Loma Linda University, has written a book about this stuff, and he says that we really should not measure success in terms of somebody who has been baptized in the baptismal font. But you have a person who has no knowledge of Christ whatsoever, and then you have a fully committed Christian, and that's a long process. And he says if you would subdivide that in 10 different stages, then success is when a person goes from stage 1 to stage 2. And success is when a person goes from stage 5 finally to stage 7 or 8. So it's a different way of looking at success, being prepared also to accept that it may be a long process. Well, we'll have to go on a little bit further. But the important thing is that if we want to create a healthy church by means of a healthy witness, we must create for them, being able to provide for them a spiritual home. Another of our teachers at Loma Linda University, Richard Rice, wrote a book, Belonging Before Believing. And he tells us that in the past, it was believing before belonging. People were taught the truth, the fundamental doctrines, and then they decided to become a member, and they hoped that they would feel at home in that community where they now came. That's, as a rule, no longer true today. Many people, especially those who've never been to a Christian church, who enter our community for the first time, they want to see what it is like. They want to have a sense that here they belong, that they are accepted with all their questions, with whoever they are. And as they have that sense of belonging, the beliefs of that community are shared with them, and gradually they will accept those beliefs also. But the order has changed from believing to belonging to nowadays, in most cases, belonging before believing. And so a healthy church must be able to provide that kind of atmosphere where that can happen. I have a few other things here that are important when we deal with this kind of thing, but let me just quickly mention a fifth criteria. A healthy church must also have a concern for justice. And when we talk about justice, there are some key issues that also have a bearing on how we are a community. Gender, how do we deal with the role of women? Ethnicity, how do we deal with the various ethnic groups in our community? Sexual orientation, are those who are different from us, are they welcome? And how about our care for the underprivileged, far and near? A healthy church has a concern for justice and will deal seriously with all these issues. That is what we are told by the Old Testament prophets. Isaiah 56, verse 1. This is what the Lord says. Maintain justice and do what is right. For my salvation is close at hand, and my righteousness will soon be revealed. Maintain justice and do what is right. That is part of being a healthy church. Micah 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's part of being a healthy Christian, of being a healthy church. So now tomorrow, and that will be at 9:30, I'll talk about the other criteria for a healthy church, ethics, principled governments, unity and diversity, I will emphasize that in particular, spirituality, and being prepared for change. Those, I think, are all criteria for a healthy church. Well, we'll have some time now for some questions, and hopefully for some answers.